you guys may or may not know this. Some of you in this group, this is a large group, you may remember this. There was a scandal about the exploitation of monkeys for farming coconuts. To make, yeah. So, okay, can we do that? We can't just resign ourselves to, treating monkeys this way. But on the other hand, I mean, again, basically all forms of fruit farming, all forms of grain farming, they involve. So, I mean, you then have a question, well, do we have some obligation? Should we set aside some research and development money to find out, is there a better way to farm wheat that's going to reduce some of these impacts and so on? I just say, I think it does open the door to a discourse I don't think anyone on earth is having right now. To my knowledge, and I've always found that very strange.
Discord is having it.
Oh, okay, great.
I think there is actually a way.
Solve the wealth problem. Oh God.
I think there is actually a way that we could stop like death by crop. I mean, we could greenhouse all of our crops so that there is no pests coming in.
Yeah, I think that moving in that kind of direction is totally a good thing to do. We do want to put money into that stuff for sure, and we want to look at which uses of money are going to have the best, reduction of harm, and we should put money into those things. But yeah, the kind of core thing I was getting at there is just, I don't think Eisel and I are disagreeing here, but there's a way that you could look at a position like mine and look at a deontological position like Francione's and superficially think that there's a similarity there, and there is a similarity, but they're not actually the same thing. There's a difference between me and somebody who's going to say, okay, well, no matter how much we crank up the suffering, there is nothing that could possibly justify harming an animal for a given purpose. Like that is, for example, Francione would oppose animal testing no matter what the situation is. Now, I oppose the vast majority. I've opposed pretty much everything I've ever heard of us doing because it's fucked and we have really bad, out-of-date ethical standards. But there are hypothetical situations where I would say, the negative that comes from this is so sufficient that human testing is justified. So, of course, there's situations where I'd bite the bullet on the animal. That is the difference between a position like mine and a deontological position like Francione's.
Right. But
so it was just because Eisel, it was just your use of the term rights and the way you were talking. I don't think you intended it, but it was just coming off as if I might hold that kind of absolutist black and white position, and I'm just making it clear that I don't.
So, yeah. I'm aware that you don't, although I haven't heard you speak on these issues this directly before. But I assume likewise. Actually, I guess it's sort of come up in passing in some of your videos. So I didn't attribute Francione's position to you, but I think it is interesting to note that on the level of rhetoric, ultimately Francione's position becomes paralyzing to him. That it literally makes him impossible. It makes it impossible for him to explain himself. He paints himself into a corner and becomes, it's impossible for him to deal with the implications of his own position. It's that self-contradictory. So when he can completely control the discourse, he's kind of okay. When he's asked a very simple question about this, it becomes unsustainable. And whereas I think your position and my position actually are workable. So yeah, it's interesting. It may be a subtle difference, but it's obviously quite important.
Yeah, no. It's I mean, with a subtle difference between my position and yours and Francione's. You mean?
Sure, but yours and mine are fundamentally the same in that.
In a lot of ways.
Well, right, but I mean, the specific examples used were grain farming and and even vivisection.
Yeah.
One of the things that destroyed my financial position on YouTube, and I don't regret it, was that I came out with my position honestly on vivisection, which actually, to use the same terms we're using here, is that vivisection is tragic, but it's not something I can oppose absolutely in this sense, And there was huge outcry, real hatred against me from other vegans that I was pro-vivisection. Now you can watch my videos and see exactly what I said. I think it's ridiculous to say I'm pro-vivisection, but I'm willing to recognize, the nature of the problem here is not the same as the problem with, for example, leather shoes that I would contrast it to. I'd say, well, look, you vegans, the vegans criticizing me, are saying I should have zero tolerance for scientific research. But you don't even have zero tolerance towards people wearing leather shoes. Leather shoes have no such justification. So there's an interesting kind of discourse that spun out of it. But I was really intensely hated for maybe like 6 months there.
Well, I would say this. I don't know a lot about the practical reality of vivisection and why we're doing it. It sounds like something that would be extraordinarily hard to justify. And if sometime you and I can get into vivisection, but the kind of point that I would make, it sort of echoes your point. I agree that when you take a deontological stance, for anyone who doesn't know what that word means, deontology is when you're holding to a position, a principle, a rule in all situations, and no matter how much you change the outcomes of that situation, you'll hold to the rule. It's like saying, okay, my rule is punching is wrong. I hold that deontologically. Even if my not punching someone will cause a Holocaust, well, it's wrong to punch someone. So there's real problems with deontology. So just to echo what Eisel said, I do think that for Francione, there are problem areas that result from his deontological position. And in terms of persuading people, he basically just has to hope the conversation doesn't really go there. For someone like me, the worst thing that you can possibly have is a problem area for me. I could literally define a problem area as an area where I also feel gray about the human ethics and I can't name the trait. So the worst case is you push me to something where I say, well, you know, I'm genuinely not sure if that's justified for animals. I can't name the trait either, so I'm genuinely not sure how I feel about doing that to certain humans. So that's a far less like crazy sounding place to get pushed to than this full commitment to never harming no matter what the situation is.
Well,
I think so. Just to be really clear, to sum up, I think there are ethical gray areas. That would be crazy to say that ethics has solved all of the problems and it's a completed science. It's not. But the point is that there's consistency for me always between my animal and human positions. You won't catch me saying it's a gray area for animals, it's not a gray area for humans, and I can't name the trait. That's a position you won't hear me say ever.
Right. So all of that I agree with. You may not have heard this, Isaac, but before Isaac became vegan, there was a catchphrase in veganism which people used to kind of simplify conversations with carnists, which was any justification for eating meat is basically the same as a justification for cannibalism. That if you can justify cannibalism in the circumstances, you can justify eating meat. So, you know, this was to kind of shut down when you were being asked about what if you're on a desert island or this kind of thing. Well, look, if you would resort to cannibalism, by the same token, you can resort to eating meat. This is actually kind of the same criterion turned inside out and backwards. Yeah. But I just mentioned for your interest, Isaac, I did speak to research scientists who were vegan or trying to be vegan and who were involved in vivisection, involved in, torturing animals to death and so on. And they talked to me about the ethical standards involved. And, I said it would be really worthwhile to have a conference of people in those areas of biomedical science and so on. But, the sort of standard propaganda line that there's absolutely zero scientific value in torturing animals to death, is not true. And of course, all the articles, for example, that Vegan Gains uses on his channel, these things are very, very often based on experiments on animals. Even scientific sources I've quoted on my channel when I've dealt with, for example, when I was dealing with brain damage caused by marijuana or something, some of these are, the information comes from torturing animals to death. So, it would be convenient to say, no, there's never any utility in this, which of course also doesn't make sense in terms of experiments on human subjects. We know both have utility. And then we have a difficult set of decisions to make coming out of that.
Absolutely, because we can look at, denying the utility and using an assertion with no evidence, a throwaway assertion like there's no value in this. That's obviously, that's not an argument. That's retarded. No one should ever do that. But so when you acknowledge that there is utility, then the question becomes, does the utility justify the action? And I think that making those kind of consequentialist type calculations is hard enough in the first place, and even harder when you have this anthropocentric bias that's going to make you err on the side of humans. So again, that's why I like to use a model based on consistency. I just like to look at, okay, with humans, there is some reason where I don't have some kind of bias, and I'm not trying to preserve some crazy right or some shit like this. This is just my honest opinion towards my own species. There is certain kind of research that would be justified, at least in certain hypotheticals, and there's certain research that obviously isn't justified. Most people would say that what the Nazis did, some of those human experiments, or in fact, all of them, I would assume, are ethically wrong and should not be done. So the question just becomes, in the animal context, is this a case where we can spell out some kind of relevant factor that, if true of humans, would make us say it's okay to do this to humans? Or is it just an actual inconsistency where we're just saying this is okay for animals, it's not okay for humans, and there's no logically consistent basis for saying so?
Right. So 2 points. That one, of course, is just cost. In reality, torturing rats to death and torturing monkeys to death is a lot cheaper than getting human subjects. So that's why the question will almost always be asked about animals rather than people. So I don't know if you want to respond to that, but that's of course.
Well, yeah, it's just whatever factor you would plug in, whether it's like cost or like financial cost or benefit of some type. It's always just, okay, well, let's say that is now, the animal cost is now the financial cost for doing this to humans. Would it be justified? If the answer is no, and you're still saying it's okay for animals, it would be an inconsistent position. If once you map the financial cost with the animal situation over to the human situation, you actually end up saying, yes, it's ethical for humans, then it would be a consistent position.
Right. Anyway, the United Kingdom has tried to take this seriously, tried to take having a procedure whereby research facilities, actually I guess now all of the European Union does this, they go through a protocol where they first have to prove that there isn't a non-animal harming alternative. So they have to exhaust alternative forms of research. So you want to do an experiment on a particular chemical. Would it be possible to do it in a petri dish instead of doing it on an animal, this sort of thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a...
Right.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, but that was the big advance, was of having a kind of legally mandated procedure where scientists had to prove that it really was necessary, that there wasn't a non-harmful alternative. But I think the other interesting aspect is just that very often the benefit of the research, almost by definition, is unknown. Is that very often you have scientists who say, look, I want to try this out. It's a hypothesis. Maybe this is going to reveal a useful chemical, a useful treatment, maybe not. Here's a chemical, I don't really know what it does, and I want to, that's part of the nature of experimentation. So yeah, the people who are really pro-vivisection, I think that's going to be their argument fundamentally, is the importance of being able to tinker with the unknown.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if tinkering with the unknown, though, is the justification, well, I mean, you could tinker with humans and you might be able to tinker with the unknown. So, would that just blanket justify anything? Most people would probably say no. So it just throws you back into the trait trap. But when you talk about the big advance, it's a kind of depressing fact that is the big advance, but it is definitely an advancement to have to at least prove there's not a viable alternative to the testing where you don't have to fuck with a sentient being.
The floor is open.
Okay, well, unless someone else wants to say something, there's actually some different shit I was going to ask Geisel about. But yeah, do you guys have any things you want to say or talk about?
I'd say one thing, probably won't last very long, but I think a lot of vegans, maybe me included, unless I've got the wrong thing, would actually probably bite the bullet on this desert island thing. I'm not sure what I wouldn't do to survive in a genuine survival situation on a desert island. I'm not sure if there's a being, like if there was some being that visited Earth that was stuck with me on the desert island, encompassed enough well-being of an entire galaxy of worth of something. Okay, I probably would die in favor of so that thing could live. Okay, but I don't think there's much on Earth that I would
Buddha,
die for. Yeah.
Would you kill me? I wouldn't kill you personally. I'm not going to kill you to live.
Gee whiz. Desert island, there's nothing else, and there's nothing else there.
Yeah, I mean, I just wouldn't kill you. I don't think it's okay to kill you. I also want to make one.
We live in a polite society, and that's what. I keep going.
Well, no. I'm just saying, if you wouldn't kill me, then you're in a situation where, okay, wait, now you're saying it's not okay to do this to humans. So if it's okay to do it to animals, you're in the trait trap, and you might find a trait. Maybe you can justify it. I don't know. For me personally, I definitely don't think that I could justify killing any mammal to survive. I start becoming a little weird around the fish zone, definitely around the bug zone. I'm like, okay, at that point you're almost talking about a holocaust of sentience when you're comparing killing a human to a bug. But either way, that's a vague question. I don't think I'd bite the bullet on killing a human or anything remotely near a human. And I'd also just point out that where someone stands on a desert island situation or on vivisection, all of these things, interesting questions, but they don't say anything about where you stand on a basic situation. Yeah.
No, they don't.
Just normal.
It's the reason I was bringing it up. Also,
but no, personally, I wouldn't kill you. And if we were on the island, Buddha, if we were on the island and we were both going to die, I mean, I'm not going to kill you, but I would maybe try to talk to you. I'd say, okay, well, someone needs to die here. Do we want one of us to survive this? We might be able to. And how are we going to make that decision? But I would never impose my will over you.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure. I couldn't make any promises in that situation.
But
that's difficult. Maybe I'm
a true friend.
Human being.
There was a third.
But I'm not sure I could say that to anyone. Literally, my family or friends. I'm not sure I could.
You would eat your mother?
I don't know. Well, I mean, there would probably be a better argument for that than eating you. I mean, she's so much older than me, but I'm not sure.
I would suggest that it's not really an ethical thing to do to eat your mother. I wouldn't
No,
eat my
but
mother.
I don't think any of those positions would be an ethical thing to do. But I think ethics sort of go out the window once you get to a certain point there.
Ethics either exist or they don't exist.
Well, only in a society, kind of. Otherwise,
I mean, look, I think ethics are arbitrary and subjective, and I'm a nihilist.
Yeah.
But if you're going to set a standard and you're going to say you want to be
up, Isaac. I think you've toughened up since I talked like a year and a half ago. Because I mean, I think part of what you're embracing, Isaac, is the idea that things like dignity can be more important than suffering. You know, like, yeah, maybe you're going to suffer a little bit more. Maybe you're going to drown yourself. Like if you're actually on an island, you have the option of starving to death or drowning yourself to die more rapidly or something. But maybe that's better. You know, maybe that's better than eating your own mother. Yeah.
I think that people have strawmanned you a little bit on the dignity thing because they kind of talk about it like it's some, deontological value completely detached from well-being. And I think that dignity probably, if we get into what your concept of dignity is and we really start hashing it out.
Right.
No, and I'm sure it has some level of connection to well-being. So, I mean, yeah, but either way, no, I mean, for my position, I don't think there's anything I've actually changed on ethically since getting on YouTube. I mean, ethics are subjective, and you just have a choice of when it comes to ethics, do I want to have consistent standards or not? If you say it's okay to have inconsistent standards, your system can justify anything. If you say I have to have consistent standards, then you can't special plea a certain situation out of the case. So when we talk about a desert island, I'm almost done. When you get to a desert island, you can say that I'm setting a standard here where it's okay to kill other humans, and you can justify killing animals in a survival situation from there. I personally don't set that standard, but what I have a problem with is anyone who tries to be dishonest and say, I set that standard for humans, I don't set it for animals, and I can't name the trait. That's my problem.
So I just point out, implicit though in your position, there could be two versions of your position, one of which is the tough version and one of which is the weak version, or the tough version and the wimpy version. And many people state the wimpy version, including, say, Anissian, including several of the atheist leaders who have addressed on my channel, atheists and skeptics. So the wimpy version being, all that is true unless or until your own personal suffering is called into question. And then it stops. Then suddenly, because I have to suffer, none of this matters anymore, and they'll kill anyone and eat anything, as has been alluded to. And I just point out, implicitly in your position, you don't see it that way. You actually think that sometimes you got to suffer, sometimes you got to fight, sometimes you got to die. That your own discomfort at least is on the line here. And I found that amazing. There were one of those guys. I'm sorry, it wasn't Sam Harris, but one of the other guys like him that I addressed on my channel once. I pointed out that he thought it was too much suffering for him to be vegan, and he lived in one of the suburbs of Los Angeles. So he lived in
that's
Los
just
Angeles,
retarded.
like,
yeah.
No, and like you think, I mean, and you and I've talked about this kind of thing. Like, okay, going to do humanitarian work in Cambodia or something, is this too much suffering or too much risk? And I think no, it's a little bit of suffering risk, but so what? If something's important, you do it. Anyway, look.
Whoa! I got to push back on that. I don't think that it's too much suffering or something like that. It's just not what personally preoccupies my mind. But I'd never say that it's. I would never resist going to Cambodia by saying it's somehow just too big a compromise to my well-being or something.
Sure, it's just a random example. I'm just pointing out that when we put these philosophies into practice, there is a question of your own skin, your own neck, on the line, and your own tolerance for suffering and risk of death and actual death. Like if you're going to join the army and fight a war, maybe you're going to die, maybe you're going to kill someone. There's one thing I wanted to branch off on. Earlier, you made a sort of a long statement about vivisection, and you mentioned the limited relevance of utility. So, you said briefly that, utility only matters to a limited extent because name the trait will be the same in either case. Like, is it the utility of torturing a human versus the utility of torturing an animal? But I just want to point out this issue of utility does matter, at least in a kind of Socratic and provocative way, because I point this out to vegans and I point it to meat eaters once in a while also. So, well, there is now in 2018 absolutely no utility in leather shoes. We could force everyone to wear the current line of, Nike sports shoes that are just as functional or more functional than leather shoes. You don't need to polish them. The U.S. Army no longer uses leather boots. They use non-leather boots and so on. So leather shoes have zero utility, and yet this ethical question still isn't pressed. I don't even know a single vegan restaurant that will refuse customers for wearing leather shoes inside. Our schools,
Yeah.
So just mention that is also an interesting thing, is where in some cases within veganism, we're in a situation of zero utility, where there's absolutely zero utility for the meat-based object or animal exploiting object. And yet it still seems to be so hard to press forward. That's all. It's an interesting comment.
Okay. I mean, there's so many different things I could say there. Like with leather, I'm not strong on this position because my legal positions are a bit different. What I'm about to say, but currently, I think that I would just be fine making leather illegal. Frankly, I don't know if there's a good argument against that, but I would just be for completely banning it. And there is also just one little thing. I don't think there's confusion between me and Eisel on this, but just in case anyone else is not tracking, when he's talking about a strong and weak version of my position, the weak version, where you're fine with this murder just so you can survive, and the strong version where you're more stoic and you say, no, it's not ethical to kill my mother or to just kill my friends if I want to live. I think that's wrong. I would just point out that name the trait is a consistency test. It is not necessarily my position. It's something you apply to a position, and either of those positions could pass the name the trait test. And then when you talk to,
that's why I said there are two versions of the position. They both comprise the same.
It might be partially my fault for how I've framed it, because people think name the trait is an argument for veganism, and it's not per se. Like Hannibal Lecter's position passes name the trait, and people have a hard time wrapping their head around it. Name the trait is an argument for veganism if you already have certain beliefs in place, like you believe in consistency, you believe in basic human rights in most situations. And then what was the last thing you said there? You're talking about the value of utility, basically, and you're just saying even when utility goes to zero.
Right, yeah.
And the core point is that when it goes to zero, we should ban it, or that it's just psychologically hard for people to give it up even when it hits zero, or what's the core thing there?
Well, I guess I'm just pointing to the absurdity of it. Of course, it's much more difficult to deal with something like finding a cure for cancer by torturing animals, because there is utility. But that at the opposite extreme, we actually do have cases we deal with every day, like leather shoes, where there is now zero utility. And yet it seems we can't make progress on that. It can be asked the question: do people think it's a civil right to buy and wear leather shoes? What is the basis for wearing leather shoes? Knowing what we know scientifically, ethically, ecologically, and otherwise. But I just say it's interesting that the problems for the vegan argument are the same, even when there's zero utility. So
okay, wait, that last little bit I didn't catch. But yeah, sorry, go ahead. You're talking about leather and utility and just hashing that out.
No, it just is. It is more like a thought experiment, but it's something I discuss with vegans, and it's something I discuss with with meat eaters also. There's no doubt that 500 years ago, leather was a crucially necessary part of human civilization, it's sad, it's tragic, etc. I'm not celebrating that fact, but we really had no substitute for it. But today, the substitutes are superior to leather and has absolutely zero utility, and yet we don't seem to have. We don't have any progress or any possibility of progress. Leather is instead celebrated as a luxury, and so on and so forth. Anyway, it's interesting. Your response to this is that you would even support leather being made illegal, but certainly in terms of a baby step or cultural step, what have you, there is pressure to have no smoking areas, even where it's basically irrational. It's part of a culture of trying to get rid of smoking. I.e. in areas where it would be perfectly safe, it wouldn't be a harm to other people to allow smokers to smoke cigarettes, but still we're wanting to push for society to make a gradual transition to having less and less smoking and ideally zero. But there is no similar pressure to have, fewer and fewer leather shoes. There's nothing like this, not even within Buddhism. And again, I was thinking about that earlier because you made an allusion to how these questions are asked when people agree with certain fundamental moral tenets. Well, everyone who subscribes to the Buddhist religion, it's absurd, but you'd think there'd be a uniform or vast majority opposition to leather shoes, and nothing like the kind exists, even in that kind of context. Zero utility plus ethical unanimity, and still there's no pressure for change. So
yeah, personally, this is somewhere where generally I would align with the consequentialists on this kind of stuff. I think that if you can't argue that there is any utility at all to something, and you can't point to any utility, and it just causes needless harm. Especially needless harm as great as skinning a being alive. that's just in the crazy zone of I don't know how anyone could ever think to justify that. And then what was
I
the
agree,
later? Oh yeah, and then with Buddhists, I was just going to say, short version. I'm perpetually amazed by how hypocritical the spiritual community is on veganism. It's crazy.
Well, agreed and agreed. But I think the only counter argument I've heard lately that would apply to leather, etc., is Matt Dillahunty's position, which is he phrases as libertarian that the maximum liberty pertains to a thing, blah, 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 so that somehow it's a civil right or a human right that you can buy and own leather. That seems to be the counter, that liberty ought to encompass all such things, that you're depriving people of their liberty to own a chopped up animal reformed into the shape of a Nike shoe. Yeah.
Now, I understand that, and I understand what you're saying, but I think that there is a way to get underneath that, because obviously, to me or you or a vegan, the problem with what he's saying there is that he's not considering the liberty of the animals. He's only considering the liberty of the humans. And once you weigh the liberty of the animals into the picture, well, now suddenly it doesn't seem like you should have the liberty to wear the leather. Just like with humans, you can't say it's my liberty to kill you. It's like, no, well, there's also the liberty of other humans. Even libertarians, it's you have as much liberty as you want without harming someone else. You can swing your fists as much as you want until you hit someone in the face. Yeah. So to get underneath that, you have to look at what is the philosophical basis for bootstrapping liberty as a value for humans, and can you find that basis without applying it also to animals? Right. So that would be how I would try to get under that.
So I actually, rhetorically, I wouldn't do it that way, because I don't want to build an argument on the concept of the liberty of cows or cow rights. I would approach it entirely in terms of human responsibility, human ecology, human ethics. That would just be my approach. But we do actually agree completely on this is just a question of rhetoric. But anyway, so there was some other topic you wanted to ask me about.
I don't remember. I think. Oh yes, I do remember. Oh yeah, and just you and I are going to have to bat our frameworks off each other at some point. I don't know if I'm feeling that today. I don't know if you are either. But because the areas where Eisel and I are going to have a problem is when we start talking about something, because our systems will point to the same answers in, I bet, like 90-something% of cases, I would assume. But there's situations where you've got something that's within the wildlife line that Eisel draws, and you're still saying that you're saying it wouldn't have any degree of rights. Like if some animal wanders in, you can just like kind of do whatever to it. I mean, that would be where I would start saying, well, no. I mean, I think we should remove it, but I don't think that it just loses all its moral value or something like that. I don't know if that's a straw man, so we can get into that in depth. But the other thing I was going to talk about was the DXE stuff, actually. So unless you have something else to say about what I just said, I can go to that.
Cool. So I think a very brief response to that, we can move on to DXE. So, I have many, many videos on this, and there's a whole playlist on what I call the wildlife management approach. So if you guys go to my channel and click on playlists, you'll see there's a lot of stuff organized. I have over 900 videos on YouTube. So most of my positions on most things in veganism are set down in video form. But, my approach to ethics is based on the concept of doing the best you can. So in terms of this question, what happens with animals that come into the city? My position is contrasted to, for example, Will Kimlicka. So Will Kimlicka is a proponent of a rights-based approach that actually animals living in the city, including rats and snakes, have animal rights and have the rights of citizens. And he has written long books and academic articles describing this. So to me, that's genuinely laughable, and I think we have to acknowledge that meat eaters kind of laugh at that for a reason. The idea that rats have the right to live in your house just as much as you do. And it's apart from the fact that it's not practicable, I also think just purely theoretically. Now, on the other hand, my position doesn't entail, I think it really, there is an obligation on us to do the best we can. Is it possible to trap the rats alive and get rid of them without killing them? Sometimes. Sometimes it's possible. You know what I mean? That's the honest answer.
Okay, well, in that case, I don't know. It seems like we're just getting hung up on the word rights then, because for me, I use the word rights really just because it's a shorthand to make people think about that thing they have in their head, that idea that in most situations, generally speaking, it's wrong to stab a human. But I'm not like wedded to the concept of rights really. It's more just about the treatment and the consistency between the treatment in whatever situation it might be. So yeah, I mean when you say oh no, I'm sure his view is crazy. He's an intersectionalist. Yeah. But when you talk about like a squirrel wandering into the wildlife line, you don't actually hold the position that Well, I mean, I don't like the word right, but you don't hold the position that it loses all of its value, or I'm going to say it's right to being treated as best as we can treat it while still getting it the fuck out of wherever we need to get it out of.
Well, I think from a legal perspective, yes. I mean that is what it boils down to. But I think we should still do our best. So bears are a good example because they're big and heavy, and in a third world country like Laos, their ability to cope with sedating a large mammal and relocating it alive to the wilderness is the government doesn't have the budget for that. Even a country like Sri Lanka, which is bankrupt, the government is really bankrupt, they can't do that. Now in Canada, we have enough money to do it to some extent. This is the reality. We can relocate a certain number of bears per year, and we should. That's very morally good.
Totally.
But if on a technical level of what is the law and what are the rights, you could never say this about a human. Like, well, we got to try to save this human's life, but if it costs too much, just shoot him in the head and fuck it.
Well, wait.
Wait.
I think you would do that in certain cases. If, for example, like there is a psychopath and he's in some small village and they don't, it's just a tiny little village. They don't have the means to subdue him. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a little village. We'll shoot someone if they're on a rampage. Yeah, exactly. So I'm actually not sure if we're going to find areas where we reach different answers here. We maybe will, but I guess the confusion for me is when you talk about rights, the way that I was receiving it, which is now seeming wrong to me, is that you actually mean once the animal crosses the wildlife line into human space, you can just do whatever to it, and that would seem like wacky land to me. If you're actually going to say that no matter where the animal is, it's always entitled to us treating it reasonably, then that's actually going to line up very, very closely with my position.
Well, I wouldn't say that precisely because of the example of farming grain and so on. I mean, I can't say to you that we treat gophers reasonably in farming grain, right? So that's why it's very similar to. Yeah.
I would argue that there's not actually an inconsistency in that situation. I think that if we had a choice, we've got humans who, for example, let's say they were reduced in size, burrow underground, can't comprehend language or morale. Well, no, I'm just being honest, though. Once you actually map all those traits, I'm going to be like, well, fuck it. I mean, there's nothing we can do. If we want to produce food, we're going to have to kill those people. And if I live in a world where I might catch a virus that turns me into one of these little gopher monster things, I would still support living in that world, as absurd and hypothetical as you get there. I would still support living in that world and saying it's okay for us to be doing farming.
Okay, but I mean, that's pretty close to being a reducto ad absurdum. I think it's almost absurd,
I actually don't think it is. Would you? Okay, no, I mean, are you saying that if you lived in in a world where you might become the gopher? If we it's really just the veil of ignorance, right? It's like if you knew you might become the gopher, would you still say that we shouldn't do agriculture?
Well, that indeed, that's a very Buddhist position, because if you believe in reincarnation, then you literally are asking people that, if you could become the gopher. But look, I just point out, I avoid getting into that hypothetical just because I accept. It's like before when I said I appreciated that you said, yes, it's tragic, like it's tragical that we have to kill these animals, but we do. Like you can acknowledge that it's bad. That's really the only difference is that I'm willing to acknowledge, look, within, like, for example, to go and shoot a bear within the wildlife preserve is a crime. Like, this should be punished as a crime. You shot this bear. Sure. But if the bear climbs through the window and goes into your basement in your own home and you shoot the bear, it's not a crime.
What if you torture the bear in your basement?
I do think that still should be a crime. So, the thing is, you said that we have an obligation to treat animals reasonably.
Yeah, that's a bit vague, but we can get into what I mean there.
No, but again, my point is, I'm not going to say to you, killing gophers on a farm is reasonable.
Oh, I would. So I'd push back.
Well, you see, it's a different thing where I'm saying, look, I'm acknowledging this is sad or tragic or bad.
Same.
Yeah, right. But I'm framing it in this different way and saying, well, there's a special place for gophers, which is the natural wildlife habitat conservation area, and then there's this farm, and we draw a line on the map. And it's arbitrary, but on one side of the line, we kill the gophers because we want to eat wheat, and on the other side, we don't. So yeah, that's my approach.
Yeah,
I'm doesn't get into those hypotheticals.
Yeah, I mean, my core point would just be looking at whether it's consistent, right? And I think that what people do is they picture, would you kill a human in a gopher field or in a field if they walked in? It's like, no. Well, wait. Why wouldn't you kill a human? Well, I mean, there's some pretty obvious reasons. You can communicate with the human and ask them to move. They're not burrowing or some shit. You can just push them out of the way. They're large and visible. They're not popping up into your combine harvester or whatever. So there's a ton of these characteristics that make it really unreasonable to do this to a human. But I think if you're honest with yourself and you go, okay, well, if we map those characteristics over to an animal, are we suddenly going to say this is so unreasonable? Personally, I would not. I don't think so.
Yeah, well, I don't like to construct arguments in terms of necessity because I don't think the necessity is real. You know,
I'm not. I wasn't doing that. I was talking more about consistency.
Oh, all right, but I mean, I think my argument also it's both embracing that these things are not necessary, i.e., like hypothetical, we could all eat rice and nobody could eat wheat, but it's also embracing that the line on the map is an inconsistency, that the fact that the bear has different rights inside the conservation area and outside it, I'm saying that is an inconsistency. It's arbitrary and it's okay. So that's it's recognizing that as an inconsistency.
I'm not really seeing the inconsistency. I think that it's reasonable for us to say that we don't want a bear in our town. And I think if you look at a human and you go, okay, there's a psychopath wandering around in here.
Okay, well, so I'll give you that's actually very close to the hypothetical I was going to.
And to just add a tiny little dimension. Also, if the psychopath breaks into your house, sure, kill him, but no, torturing him would also be a problem. So with all of these, I'm always looking at, is it consistent?
Okay, well, I think this is the real comparison to humans. Let's say you have quite a large special home for the insane, which has a garden they can walk around in. So it is a little bit more like a nature conservation area. And inside this, inside this special area, they can't hurt other people or can't interrupt their daily business or what have you. There are some safeguards. But if they wander outside of it, they'll be captured and drugged and put back inside it.
Sure.
I know this is not that wildly hypothetical, as you can imagine. This is not that. So if they're inside the asylum, they have certain kinds of liberties and rights and what have you. And if they're outside, they'll in effect be hunted. That's kind of what we're saying about wildlife. But again,
I agree with that.
Yeah. Sure.
It's a pretty good analogy.
I think the point is, you can, from your position, approach my position. I don't think they're so.
Well, yeah, and the whole thing is, unless you're actually going to find some area where I apply a consistency test to your position and it's not consistent, then I don't know that your position is out of line with my position.
Yeah, this is shocking to you.
No, it's not shocking to me. It's just you seem to be talking as if there's something fundamentally inconsistent about what we're doing to the gopher. I might be misinterpreting you there, but I actually don't.
Okay. All right. So, that's an interesting way to put it. I guess, my point is, we ought not to kill the gopher. I mean, I'm just acknowledging that in terms of what's morally right. We ought to value the gopher's life more than a handful of grain. But we don't, and I'm willing to recognize that as tragic. It's just kind of a moral and aesthetic evaluation of it. Sure.
I don't like the reduction to a handful of grain or a soy latte or whatever it is that someone wants to say, right? Because the thing is, you have to look at the standard you're setting. Once you're saying it's okay to kill animals in non-essential situations, which you have to say to get civilization off the ground. If we're saying essential situations only, we're going back to an agrarian society where we're regressing to the dark ages or something. So most people would say the trade-off there for well-being is just you're going so far downhill that we can't set a necessity-only standard. So, but the thing is, once you're going to say, okay, well, I'm going to set some standard other than necessity, then you have a very hard time arguing against something like the grain farming. And again, for me, the core point is just, would I accept this being done to myself if I were put in that situation? And to me, if I look at something like being stabbed to death completely needlessly to be made into a hamburger, no, that's fucking ridiculous. But if you're talking about the farming that's for our civilization, if you're talking about industrial activity, and you're talking about they can't avoid getting in the way, and there's not really another way to deal with them, definitely not all of them. Well, at that point, I'm just going to say yes.
Right. I sympathize with your position.
But do you disagree? Is my question. So I'm not seeing where.
All right. I only disagree in that it seems to me your position is much more complex than mine. You know, you brought in a lot of complicating factors, and someone could
I don't.
challenge.
I could sum it up to a few sentences.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me do devil's advocate for a second here, because this isn't how I feel about it, but something a meat eater might say to you. A meat eater might say to you, well, you're using the same justification so you can eat bread that a meat eater uses so he can eat bacon. The meat eater really feels that it's justified, that it's reasonable to kill this pig so he can enjoy eating a certain number of pounds of meat, and you think it's okay to kill so many thousand gophers to produce so many kilograms of wheat. You know, like this is the reality. Ultimately, there's a mathematical formula here for the number of large, you know, animals with brain. They have a brain and 2 eyes and 2 hands and 2 feet. I mean, the gophers really are, you know, they're highly intelligent, you know, mammals and so on. It's not as exotic as a microscopic insect or something. So, you know, I think your position, because of its complexity, opens itself to that line of questioning, and you can answer it, and that's fine. But I think mine is simpler. So Occam's razor, I think I have a little bit of an advantage there.
I don't really know about that, because the thing is, I could understand how someone could misinterpret it and ask questions like that. But for me, I mean, first of all, I'm talking about consistency. So consistency, I would apply that to your position, my position, whatever, and we'd still ask the same kind of questions to see if your position is consistent. If you were one of these beings, who, if you ran a risk with a like Rawlsian veil of ignorance of becoming one of the beings outside of the line, would you still draw the line? That's effectively asking the same thing. And then with one sec, just let me come back. And then the thing is, when you're saying, oh, if you bite the bullet on one, you have to bite the bullet on the other, that's like the thing a carnist might put to you. I would point out, well, no, there's a real categorical difference there in terms of why the killing is happening. I would bite the bullet on one and not the other, and I think you would too. Are you going to say you'd bite the bullet on being killed for the hamburger? I sure don't think so.
But you are of intention, because you're saying of why one is done.
I think intention matters, sure. But
So,
just the point
right.
being that they're not equivalent. You can't say you accept it for this context, therefore you have to accept it for this context.
So I do think my position is a bit stronger than yours. They're very similar, but I do think my mode of argumentation for it is stronger than yours, because it avoids these things. What is my position if I am the gopher? I think I have a right to stand up as the gopher and say, this is an injustice. Why am I being punished, persecuted, hunted, and killed for having crossed a line I didn't know was there, that I didn't understand? I'm living by the laws of my own tribe, so to speak. And here you are punishing me for breaking a human law, a human concept that nobody explained to me. There was no sign or fence that I could understand or perceive, you know, and so I left the conservation area, and maybe there is no conservation area even, but whatever. There is no adjacent conservation area. I'm trying to survive in this field, and I'm being, you know, persecuted and murdered in these horrible ways. And not only that, you humans take no responsibility. You do this year after year after year with no end in sight. You do it infinitely. You have no plan to ever address this injustice. You do it again and again just because it's convenient for you. Yeah.
I think we should find a plan and minimize deaths from all of our industrial activity. But yeah, so that would actually be the point where I would say your position is not consistent and mine is, and that means even if mine takes a minute longer to explain, which doesn't have to, but that it would actually be a superior position because it comports with logic. All right, so if you're saying that you would not bite the bullet on becoming the gopher in the on the other side of the line with a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, your position actually contains an inconsistency. Mine doesn't.
Okay, so I think not, because my position is that it's tragic whether I'm on the human side or the gopher side. So
wait, Aizal, the question. Okay, then let me put it to you precisely. You don't know if you'll become a human or a gopher. Would you draw the line?
Sorry, but is the question, would I eat bread, or is it would
no,
I
no,
draw the line?
the question is, you don't know if you're going to become a human or a gopher. You're currently just a spirit floating in space. You will randomly be chosen to be one or the other. Would you draw the line? Do you think the line is generally justified and fair? That's what this is getting at. So would you draw the line if you don't know if you're going to be a human or a gopher?
No, I think from the gopher's perspective, it's terrible and unfair and tragic. Yeah. Sure.
Well, wait, but you're going just to the gopher's perspective. So I'm asking from a universal kind of perspective.
So I agree. Yeah. I think it's bad both from the human perspective and from the gopher's perspective. Yes, right. So yeah,
I would assume that.
Right.
No, I would take a different angle, and I mean, maybe I can persuade you to, because I think it's still in line with your position and can make total sense. I would just encourage saying, yes, of course I'd fucking bite the bullet on the line. I mean, if I don't know if I'm going to become a human or a gopher, I'm still going to say the line is justified because of a broader picture of the nature of what we're doing and what the benefit is, and just that it's part of the function and progress of civilization. So if you tell me I've got a Rawlsian veil, I don't know which I'm going to come out on the other side of, the gopher or the human, do I think it's ethically reasonable to draw the line? I'm going to say yes to that. If you say no, then you're actually saying you're arguing for an inconsistent ethical framework if you would say no and then you'd go ahead and draw the line.
Okay. Well, right, but that was my initial point. I said to you,
and just final little thing. I just want to point out that it doesn't mean that your position is necessarily inconsistent, because you can still take this whole wildlife management approach and say, yeah, I mean, if I have the Rawlsian veil, I am going to bite the bullet. Sure. I mean, I think it's reasonable that we draw the line. Right. So it's just, if you don't say that, though, then you have inconsistency.
Right. But I just pointed to you, I said several times that this is the inconsistency that I embrace in my system, that the line itself is arbitrary. And is
okay, so the problem with that...
I myself at the start said, well, I think it is inconsistent that, for example, the bear is treated one way on one side of the line and not on the other, and it doesn't make any kind of choice. It's not consciously, choosing. It's not being punished for a crime. It's committed. So I'm saying I do think this is it's kind of a moral flaw in my system, but it's not one I'm concealing. It's one I'm putting out front and saying, look, I think this is something we have to commit to. And if we commit to it, it's going to lead us down a path of taking seriously a set of moral responsibilities that will ameliorate the situation.
Okay, there's not so much I could say there. Okay, so first of all, I totally agree with you that we should do whatever we can to ameliorate the situation. No debate there, 100%. Let's use our resources as best as we can to ameliorate as many animal lives as possible. Totally agree. Then I want to make two other points. One is, if you allow in an inconsistency, your ethical system collapses. It's kind of like the principle of explosion in logic. Once you say it's okay to be inconsistent about ethics, you can justify any ethical position. And then final point,
sure.
I just want to try to tip your intuitions a bit, because I think that if we talk about it a bit, you will actually eventually want to say, yeah, I'd bite the bullet on that. If we talk about psychopaths for a second, you're in a Rawlsian veil, you don't know if you're going to become a human or a psychopath. Would you still draw the mental asylum line for the psychopath?
You're right. You're correct.
I think you'd say yes, and I think that you're trying to be very kind to animals and think clearly and see the case of the gopher, and you could do that with the psychopath too, but broader picture, the line is justified. Okay. So I would encourage biting the bullet. Then your position is fully consistent.
So the counter argument I have is very simple. So thus I state it in full, because it's incredibly simple. I don't believe that an inconsistency of this kind causes my moral system to collapse, precisely because it's based on the understanding of a plurality of moral systems. That I'm talking about two separate moral systems. Now, again, that may be evil, but I believe that is possible. We have to recognize that you could say, okay, here's one moral and ethical system that exists in the ocean, and here's one that exists on land, or even a system of physics. We say, okay, there's the hydrodynamics, the way physics work in the water, and then we have a separate set of dynamics for how physics works on air and the land. Now, just we do the math differently. We do different kinds of calculations. Hydrodynamics are very complex math to do. So, in that sense, I know your point when you say as soon as you admit an inconsistency, and I remember seeing you debate this with some neo-Nazi type people, where you say, "Look,
really,
you can't just say this is inconsistent,
Whoa,
but you want it anyway."
Where'd you see that?
On YouTube. Forget.
I don't know what you're talking about. Sorry, go on though. I don't know what
you were talking to someone who was advocating for the ethno-state. And you pointed out to them, look, if you're going to accept this kind of inconsistency, then you'll accept any inconsistency. I understand your point in that, but the point is, I don't think this is true. That you're saying it's a type of flaw that causes an ethical system collapse. When you say, look, here's one set of rules within a nature conservation area, which may include, for example, nobody has the right to cut down a tree. Whereas, obviously, on your private property, you do have the right to cut down a tree, or on a farm, or what have you. So where I'm just drawing attention to the fact that I actually have a different set of, prescriptive rules, a different kind of set of ethical standards on one side of the line versus the other. So therefore, I don't think it's a collapse. It's about plural ethical systems.
Yeah, so you'd have also different rules for a human if they're in one country or another, or if they're in a certain area or another. It's still, I would say, one system. Correct. And if you want to go to the physics analogy, it's still all comports broadly with the laws of physics. So I would consider the separation into two systems actually point.
Right.
I think that it's all
Okay.
one system. It just has
But
different
that-
elements.
I criticized myself in that nobody else pointed that out first. I pointed out that my system would be like having First Nations reservations and saying, okay, Native people have a different set of rights over there than they have over here, which is what Canada did and what many colonial countries did around the world.
Let me
But
make
it is
one
something that's
thing
existed
clear.
historically. You have a line on the map,
yeah.
right?
I don't have a problem with your system per se. It's more like your position on your own system. Because I would accept your system. Well, it's you who's saying I partially accept my own system.
Right. Yeah. No. Well, no. I accept my system. I just view one element of it as tragic. So.
Well, no, because you're saying you'd actually reject the system as the You're saying like you're saying if I was in a Rawlsian Vale and I didn't know what position I'm going to end up in, I wouldn't bite the bullet on creating my own system. I mean, I would, and I think you would too if we talk about psychopath versus human instead of just gopher versus human.
Okay, when you put it that way, would I accept the creation of my system? Yes. No. Then, sorry, you changed your phrasing slightly. Before you just said, would you agree with drawing the line or something? Okay. In the way, yes. No, you're correct. So then I would.
Okay, so then I would say it's consistent.
I would just, from a rights discourse perspective, you could say, well, you believe in having one set of animal rights in the city and another set of animal rights, on the nature reservation for the same bear, for the same
I'm
rat,
not
for the
saying
same
that's
gopher.
inconsistent.
Right.
That's not inconsistent.
Right. Well, yeah, but from a layperson's perspective, it is a type of inconsistency, right? And
Someone who's not
right.
philosophically literate, but
sure,
me and you aren't
sure.
going to say that's inconsistent.
Right. But I mean, in the same way, I think someone can attack my system by saying, well, would you believe in one set of human rights if you're standing over here, and another set of rights if you're standing over there? And that's the reality we all live with. I don't have the same human rights when I'm in England or in Saudi Arabia that I do when I'm in Canada. That is the reality of the world in 2018.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, and I wouldn't want to have the Saudi Arabian rights. That totally violates my ethical system, and I'm not down for it. But I am down for the fact that there's different rights that are permitted based on your behavior or your location, even within one ethical system.
Yes. So no.
Like if you wander onto someone's property, you're trespassing. Your rights are slightly different in that situation.
So,
I mean, they're still in line with the overall ethical system, but someone is allowed to defend themselves because now you pose a threat and they don't know what the fuck you're doing.
Okay. Anyway, so we agree on everything except kind of matters of rhetoric and aesthetics then. And, sorry, I know it's a minor changing in your phrasing. When you put it that way, I suddenly realized, okay, yes, then even as the gopher, I do agree with it.
Yeah, because I'm using the term, would you draw the line? Would you build
kind
your
of
own
like
ethical
if you're
system
gonna create the
interchangeably?
world. Right. This kind of thing. Okay, from this perspective, kind of standing outside the system.
Well, in that case,
but
I'm going to say that I don't actually see how your system is inconsistent. Do you think that there's any inconsistency within it?
No,
like actual philosophical
No,
inconsistency, not just different rule sets for different contexts.
I mean, no, I know it is high praise from you to say that there's no inconsistency, and I accept the compliment. I was just going to say, on the level of aesthetics and rhetoric, though, one of the differences is if you think of this argument taking place on a stage, your stage has a lot of furniture on it, and mine is very spare and clean and empty. Like you brought onto the stage the concept of the progress of civilization and things like this, and I don't do that. Now, that doesn't mean you're wrong or bad. It really doesn't. I'm just noting, like when I said before, well, my approach is simpler. That is kind of what I mean. That you quite readily bring in these complicating factors, which I don't. I really try to keep it very, very simple in terms of how much furniture is on stage.
Well, that's just because I was laying it out in detail for you. But if you just ask me quickly, I mean, if you say, what was the example we use? Gophers for grain farming. I mean, I would just say, basic answer to that is that there are traits that justify the difference of treatment in that situation, and I would bite the bullet if the traits were present.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be big. It can be, I can say it in about 9 words.
Right. No, but I just point out, like, progress of civilization as a source of necessity, this gets into those other problems. Like, you may feel the progress of civilization requires taking lunatics and locking them up, but somebody else doesn't. You may feel the progress of civilization justifies grain farming, even if it kills 1,000 gophers a month, and somebody else does. So I just say I really fastidiously try to avoid bringing those kinds of things onto the stage.
Well, yeah. I mean, the core thing that I'm looking at is just is there some kind of difference between humans and animals that, if true of humans, would justify doing this to humans? And I would say yes.
If you had miniature humans sticking in the earth eating the grain.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I would actually consider the fact that it becomes that funny actually a point for how obvious the truth of what I'm saying is.
Right.
I mean, of course, it's like that's not the situation with humans. Obviously,
Well,
it starts looking like a completely different ethical
right.
world, doesn't it?
Right, it does, but I think actually it's interesting because if I stick with that, so the miniature humans eating the grain, I think we would take it much more seriously that we had a responsibility to have nature conservation areas for those miniature humans.
Okay, yeah,
we would
that
take
was
that
the other
probably
point I wanted to
seriously,
hit, which is I totally agree with you on that also, which is we want to do as much as we possibly can to improve the rights for the beings that are affected by our industrial processes or whatever else we're doing.
Right.
Not
well,
the
you and
rights,
I,
the treatment or whatever. They're just their well-being.
yeah, I understand. Don't worry. I'm not thrown off by the use of the word. You and I do, but of course it's remarkable that nobody else does. And
Others
you know,
do.
well, okay, remarkably few people give a damn. I did a book review on a book written by a scientist, although it's not a science book, which is called Half Earth. I can put the link into the thing. But anyway, I'll say why I'm sharing this link now. But anyway, this is a book review of a book that made the argument that 50% of the Earth's surface should be given over to habitat conservation areas. Thus the title. So there, I believe that's in the right. It's in the it's in the hashtag debate crucible. Hold on, sorry, so that's in the wrong discussion area.
I'm outside and on my phone, so I can't.
No problem. No,
yeah,
it's for other people. It's for other people listening. It's fine. So I'm just going to post that link there. But to me, that was a really interesting, question to be asked. I mean, I think the book sucks. It's a very negative book review. But when you say, well, we have a responsibility to do this, almost nobody is interested in asking that question. I mean, now obviously, I don't think it can possibly be 50% of Canada's landmass that's reserved for wild animals. But what's it going to be? 5%, 15%, 25%? Like what is it going to be? I think those are really interesting questions. Ethically, pragmatically, and otherwise.
Yep, and here's another thing. When you go to is civilization justified, I would actually suggest most people are not willing to abandon civilization. When you're talking about eradicating some particular thing we're doing and it's going to bring us back to the Dark Ages or to some agrarian society, that actually, I don't see how that's not just completely persuasive on my point. We wouldn't bite the bullet on that. There's a serious trade-off here for well-being.
Right.
If we set a standard that would make grain farming illegal, I mean, what would happen to the world? It'd be crazy land.
I agree with you completely, and I think the irony is that the last generation of vegan leaders, people like Francione, who's still alive but barely,
the old guard,
right? But they're not on the same page with us at all.
No,
and
they're
you
not.
and I mean, we're very different people. We've come to this conclusion from a totally different logical and philosophical set of premises, and we've both come to that exact conclusion. I mean, as you just stated it, you can't possibly have a moral standard that makes grain farming untenable. I agree with you.
You can, but no one wants it. I don't want
Right.
it.
We're not going to do that, right? But
no, we're not, and it's just not going to happen.
Right. But that wasn't obvious at all to Gary Francione and his generation of activists. So that's interesting. And you and I think
specifically did they say that on that? What's his position there? Does he think we should? This is just different. We shouldn't do fuck all for these animals. Was that his position?
No, he really breaks down in connections because he can't accept it, and he ultimately just goes back to an ethics of intention. That ultimately you have to have good intentions because it's to him it's not acceptable to even kill one rat or to kill one groundhog. He can't. His moral system doesn't abide that. So yeah, and I sympathize, but it's insane. His position is ultimately driving him crazy and drives others crazy.
Well, yeah, and the ethics of intention thing, I think we'll align here. Actually, I think intention is ethically relevant, but not the only thing that matters. Because if you just go to intention, well, now it's what? Anything's justified just because of your intention?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I don't know. My honest opinion is that the ethics of intention arguments are always kind of pathetic. I mean, well, you got drunk, but you say you didn't intend to get drunk. That may be meaningful. I mean, it may
let me give you a really black and white one. You and I are in the kitchen. Scenario 1, I stab you to death.
Right.
Scenario 2, I turn around with a knife and poke you by accident and you die. I mean,
right.
Huge difference, and the difference is just intention, right?
You're right. Yeah.
But again, I can point to other situations where the intention is constant, but some other thing creates a problem. So you can tell intention also is not the only thing that matters.
But in this case, sir, I mean, you're right. It's talking about intention globally. It includes consensual sex and rape, the different distance.
Of course.
The difference between murder and manslaughter, etc. But in the specific locus for this discussion was the idea that killing animals is okay because you didn't mean to kill them. You just meant to farm grain, even though you know that farming grain absolutely requires you to kill them. For this discussion, it's like, well, if you want to talk about intention in this kind of context, it seems to me kind of pathetic. So yeah, that's my basic feeling. Okay. Did you want to ask something about DXE?
Yeah, I could keep talking about this. Yeah, other shit. I would just say summing up on that I'm not actually seeing areas where we diverge. Because if you ask me technically, like, I am also pose a line around civilization and saying we're going to treat animals differently when they wander into here. And I'm still in all situations saying we should do the best we can for them. And we don't seem to actually diverge on treatment anywhere so far. So,
well, I think
the fact that we should improve the field animal lives. So I'm not seeing any actual ethical difference in our position there.
Well, maybe a subtle difference is just the question of how you root the meaning. Sorry, pardon me. How you root animal rights or whatever substitute you're using for. What is the homeostatic norm? How is it that you think animals ought to be treated? My answer all comes from the wildlife. They'll just say it's based on their situation in a wildlife reserve. So I'm saying that's the norm I want to turn to, and the other things are derivative of that. So there's a different, maybe a difference in terms of priority or how you perceive.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would just say that gets to meta ethics and the underlying give animals the rights we give them. And you might find this kind of weird, but I just avoid that. I literally don't go into that because people have already bootstrapped certain rights for humans. I mean, I don't avoid it. I've talked meta ethics for hours and hours in here with plenty of usually vegans, not carnists. But the point that I go to is I just look at our human rights model and I look for consistency. And you can argue to veganism right there, and then you're just reduced to arguing about fucking weird gray cases.
Okay,
so I don't even need to deal with why we're bootstrapping it. Well, yeah, let's go to DXE unless you want a final word on that.
Well, no, I think though that is an interesting sort of difference because then you're basically saying you argue through a parallelism with human rights. And I think that it could in theory get you into trouble when people say, well, therefore this dog, this castrated dog that's lived its whole life as a human plaything, this domesticated animal has certain rights, or even the rats in the basement and so on. I don't argue that way. For me, the norm is not to look at domesticated dogs, to look at it's to look at the wolf.
No, but Isel, you do still give, like, quote unquote, we're using rights loosely here, but you do still quote unquote give them the right, for example, not to be tortured, the rat that wanders into your house.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. No.
Okay. Well, yeah. Either way, I'm seeing a well, I'm seeing a difference of how
two positions that are incredibly similar, but kind of perceived. But I've never heard you guys. But I just mentioned in terms of a difference, maybe in practice, though. I've never heard you arguing about the importance of wildlife habitat preservation areas and that kind of thing. Now, maybe it's just never come up. It's just not what you're debating with people. But I mean, if that's important to your system of ethics,
Yeah, I'm not talking about that shit when we have someone sitting across from me who's talking about stabbing an animal for a hamburger. We can go to talking about the wildlife and reasonable, hard ethical questions when I know I'm at least talking to someone who can solve basic ethical questions.
Okay. Well, I just mentioned though, in terms of, because again, you may not know how different you are from other vegans in this. You may not be aware. I mean, there's a huge school of thought in veganism that wants to reduce suffering of animals in the wilderness. And that's
we've argued about this, bro. This is where the real Python meme comes from.
So there you go. So maybe that's where our positions really become different then, because I think it is that basically that's the norm I depart from. However much suffering bears endure in the wild, that's okay. That's normal. That's what this ethical system is based on. It's not based on the idea that bears should be provided with painkillers and a cushion to put under their head as they lie dying, in the forest. So, that's maybe a difference.
We agree practically that any proposed solution to this, like dumping tofu packets into the Amazon or like whatever you want to talk about, it's like just full blown retarded. But if you go to like a technical, philosophical, abstract situation, you and I do diverge here, and we diverge massively. And I actually really am not on board with what you say.
So we found the difference.
One sec,
we found the difference.
Okay, we did find the difference, but this is one that we've known about because we argued this before for a while. But the basic difference here is if we go to a situation where you have a magic wand and you can wave the wand and nature keeps functioning the exact same way on every single level, except the subjective experience of being killed and eaten to death just disappears from nature, I would wave that wand and Isel wouldn't. So that's our difference there.
So
he thinks there's value and meaning to the suffering or something, if I'm not strawmanning. I thought that was what you said.
I'm a nihilist. I believe in nothing. But I would put it this way. So for you, the ultimate value here is reducing suffering. Or
no,
avoiding
it's
suffering.
it's a value though.
Oh, okay. But for me, the value is the wilderness itself, is the wildlife management paradigm, as I put it, like just managing wildlife. That is value enough where the discourse stops, and I'm not going to inquire further. I mentioned you mod vegans seriously talk to me about preventing bears from committing rape against other bears.
Oh yeah,
and preventing bears from engaging in cannibalism against other bears in the wilderness. Now, I mean, I think that's a bizarre question. If you have pet bears in your home, that's where these things get really ridiculous. But you're talking about bears living in the forest that engage in rape and cannibalism. You want to police the morality of bears. This is fucking
it's crazy.
retarded.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. No,
With my view, that's consistent. But Isaac, I could say to you, Isaac, you're being inconsistent. If you can prevent a bear being raped or dying in cannibalism from your position consistently, if you wouldn't do it for a human, if you happen to be walking down the street and you see a human who's going to be raped or cannibalized, you'd intervene. If you're walking through the forest and you see a bear doing it to a bear, name that trait. Why wouldn't you intervene, Isaac? So you.
Yeah. Well, I think that the whole thing there is you're talking about the function of the ecosystem, right? So, for example, if we're talking about like just predators, what would happen if we stopped the predators from preying, right? So I just want to point out here, Isel, there's a level of principle and a level of practice to this. So we completely align to 1,000% that the practical solutions, like send out anti-rape bear squads into the wild, like that's all just crazy zone. But the real difference is in the philosophical abstract of you can have everything function just as well, but you can remove the just barbaric shitty suffering of nature. Would you do it or not? It seems that you say no and I say yes.
Could I just interject here? I think there is an ongoing discussion about gene drives and sort of using them to prevent suffering in the wild. So it is a sort of a discussion that's going on within some philosophical communities.
I can't say.
Activists. Yeah, the effective activists do so-called research about reducing wild animal suffering. So I've seen some stuff. It's mostly pretty crazy.
Well, so what I can tell you though is that when there are, practical ways to stop these things, then yeah, I'm all for doing it. Like if I saw two animals of the same species, it's not, I know that they have an abundant food source or whatever, and it's like, let's say it's cats or something and one's killing the other out in the street, I would probably, just stop that cat fight. But when you go to a broader, like, okay, do we want to try to stop wild animal predation or something? It's like, well, the reason I say no to that is because there is no practical way to do that. If there actually were, and we can just hypothetically go there, we just say we have the philosophy wand and you can do it, at that point I'd say yes. So I don't know, you can spell out more on that if you want, but I think that kind of
I think that's it.
shows
I think we both agree that in the domain of bears are allowed to live by the law of the bear and not by human laws or human ethical concepts. You've created a very abstract situation in which you could modify the wilderness itself. But I think both you and I agree in the real world, there is no way to modify the wilderness, not in the sense we're talking about here. We can't modify the nature of nature, nor do we really want to. I don't think we want to design the forest or something to minimize the amount of bear cannibalism, for example, which you could do. You could tranquilize bears and separate them or something. You could try to come with some crazy scheme. We're not interested in that.
Well, yeah, my problem with that more stems from things like, is that the best use of resources? Is that actually practically going to function, or is it just some retarded human idea that's going to have some horrible ecological consequence we aren't seeing? But if there's real world practical solutions that are actually attainable and don't cost some massive amount of money or have some huge problem with them, then I do say yes to those.
Okay, even though it's in the wilderness.
Even though it's in the wilderness. But
Okay, 'cause
again,
I would-
I don't want
Good.
me to
No.
some weird
No, no,
shit
I think
like
that's good,
the
though. I think
anti-rape
you've
bear
clarified-
squads. We're
No, no,
talking.
I think you've clarified the difference between us, though, because I think the difference. I think this is the difference is that I don't want to apply human values to the wilderness.
I just
and
don't
think
want
you're willing to, which is okay.
Yeah, I just don't want to see a ISIL video come up where anything is being talked about along the lines of crazy wildlife management strategies, and I'm being said to agree with them.
Can we get the definition of wilderness?
Well, I think we're actually getting ready to move off of this and talk about DXE. I mean, he's just talking like outside.
But I am talking about real life wilderness, so it's wilderness as it actually exists in Yosemite National Park, in a national park in the real world today. It's not anything exotic.
Yeah. Okay, so does anyone have any idle questions there, or do we want to move along for either of us?
I was gonna ask, like, wouldn't you say maybe it would be something like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years off? Wouldn't you want to maybe consider something like actually trying to go in that direction of reducing?
Who's that directed to?
Potentially.
Who's that directed to?
I guess both of you guys. I'm curious. I mean, I guess ISIL wouldn't do it at all. You'd say yes?
I'm just wondering what ISIL's sort of morality, sort of, if it's not suffering, then what is it that motivates him to treat animals well and be vegan, etc.?
Yeah. Okay, so two reasonable questions, but in answer to the first, I think that the answer to the first question is almost implicit in the meaning of the word conservation, which is just I'm not trying to conserve nature in order to pervert it into something other than nature. I don't want to turn the forest into Disneyland. Like if Disneyland is a place where no animals are harmed, that's Disneyland. That's not the forest. That's not what the national park is for. So those are very different things. The question from Scythian, I actually got to see the person's name while they were speaking. I have a separate playlist on my channel which is about nihilism, my own philosophy of nihilism, historical nihilism. But so you can watch those videos, and I think entertain exactly those questions. But the short answer is that my ethic is based on an idea of doing the best you can, and as simple as that may be, I really do not see how doing the best you can is compatible with eating bacon or drinking cow milk. Given a very basic awareness. Yeah.
Let me push back on that. Doing the best you can. Let's say that the best you can actually includes you have the philosophy wand.
Sorry, I don't understand. You have the philosophy wand. I don't understand.
So the philosophy wand that can just remove the suffering from nature, but nature still goes on working just perfectly. So now the best you can includes the ability to do that.
Right. So I think I can push back on that by using the same terms I just used, which is like if you rob the venom of its sting, so to speak, aren't you destroying nature in a very real sense? Aren't you turning nature into Disneyland? Nature shouldn't be a golf course.
Well, wait, but the way that I'm saying that is it has no impact at all on the function of the ecosystem, on evolution, on anything. It still all continues functioning perfectly. Just maybe there's even certain types of suffering that we say we leave for some reason because they're valuable, in the same sense that the suffering of working out is valuable or something. But we're talking about just the feeling of to go. Like we've ended up here before because I think this is a problem with. Personally, I think it's a problem with your position, although I like your position overall. But it goes back to just the feeling of being eaten by a python. We're back to real pythons, though, part 2. I just would say, like no one should have to endure that. Let's just remove that feeling. If that, we both agree it doesn't fall within what you can reasonably do, so we're not doing that. But if it were, I would want that 100%.
So I think my position becomes, in effect, the conservation of nature includes the conservation of suffering. That's based on, you can quote me on that, but that's basically no, that's fine. That if you're going to take the suffering out of nature, you're changing nature, you're perverting nature, and this is, as I say, let's not rob the wasp of its sting, let's not rob the snake of its venom. No, if this is worth conserving, then it's worth conserving.
Why is making something better perverting?
But I regard the suffering as one more color of paint in the palette. Sure.
Would you say conserving nature is your axiom rather than well-being, or?
Yes, I think that is actually a reasonable thing to say about me. I normally don't speak in terms of axioms at all, but yes, that I'm putting this kind of axiomatic value on the concept of wildlife. Thus, I describe my position of veganism as wildlife management paradigm. Sure.
But you're a nihilist, so why do you value nature so much in its current form?
Right. Well, sorry, we did a long conversation on nihilism about a week ago.
Because you could turn it into a better form. I don't see why you wouldn't do that.
I want to pipe in there for a sec, just because I am also a nihilist, but I always draw well, I always who's laughing right now? I couldn't even tell who that was, but yeah, no, I'm also a nihilist, but I draw a very important distinction between two senses of the word nihilism. There is a term that refers to the ontology, like meta-ethics, the nature of morality. Do you think that there is an external source for morality, or is it fundamentally meaningless? In that sense, sure, I'm a nihilist. But when it comes to, so that you call that descriptive nihilism. An accurate description of reality is to say that it is nihilistic. But then when we talk about prescriptive ethics, the kind of world that I want to build, I do not want to build a world based on the notion that nothing matters. So I am a descriptive nihilist. I'm not a prescriptive nihilist.
Right, definitely. But if I guess so, if you didn't have, if you weren't a, if you are prescriptive, or sorry, if you are a descriptive nihilist, then you would think that the way nature is described currently is irrelevant, and we can make it better.
So I think I am both descriptive and prescriptive nihilist. But go on, yeah.
Okay,
no, wait, whoa, no, you're not, Azel. You believe in creating, in treating beings in certain ways and having an ethical system.
To give an example, in China, people believe in communism. I want them instead to believe in nothing. I want them instead to be nihilists. I mean, that's prescriptive nihilism. You know?
Well, wait, one second. But a true, full-on prescriptive nihilism is like if you interacted with like a Krilltard, who's this other server out there, you'd be like, I am not that. Full-on prescriptive nihilism is I don't want any system of rights for humans. I don't want anything to do with treatment. It's just we can just do whatever the fuck we want. Nothing matters at all. And you do want to create an ethical system. Your wildlife management thing, that is an ethical system you're talking about.
Sure. I think, though, that with the position you're describing, I've never heard of this before, the Krilltards. I think that's really based on a misunderstanding of what nihilism is, because nihilism is fundamentally a criticism of belief. It can be described as the position there is nothing to be believed in. So, yeah. Atheism is merely not believing in a god, but nihilism also includes not believing in communism, or even not believing in Freudianism. There are people for whom Sigmund Freud's theories became virtually a religion. So, this is a rejection of belief. But prescriptively, do I think others, or in theory, everyone, should likewise reject belief? I do. So therefore, I think properly understood and defined, I am a prescriptive nihilist. Yeah. Well,
wait. I think prescriptive and descriptive nihilism, unless someone else is already there, I don't think those are even like accepted terms in philosophy. It's just a short offhand distinction that I've made, because people think when I say I'm a nihilist or I don't believe in objective morality, I think that it's subjective. That what follows from my position is I don't think that we should have a human conversation about how to create a better world. And I really try to separate those things. And I say a descriptive nihilist is someone who says reality is devoid of meaning. A prescriptive nihilist is someone who goes on to say, and therefore we shouldn't create an ethical system.
Okay, I totally understand why you're using that shorthand. I'm just responding to it.
So not by. I understand you're probably referring to a formal, some kind of definition that's generally accepted in philosophy, like totally. But the way I'm putting it right there, you wouldn't align with prescriptive nihilism.
I would just point out. Sorry, I mean you've done us the favor of pointing out that this is a philosophical distinction of your own creation. I think most of the philosophical distinctions I talk about with nihilism are of my own creation, because there are a few, published nihilists like Max Turner and so on. But no, the stuff I'm just explaining, I don't think is well documented or well understood in English or any other language. So yeah, no, I mean, what I've just said to you, even about clarifying that nihilism is really about belief. Sadly, I don't think that is widely understood at all. Although I notice when I talk to other people who identify as nihilists, they right away get quite excited to hear it, and they say, wow, you're stating something more clearly that I haven't heard stated that way before. That in
Well,
terms of contrasting nihilism to atheism. But no, but that stuff is my own material.
Well, I mean, the whole reason I went there is just because someone was trying to get you on you're a nihilist, why do you believe in building a better world? And I was like, just kind of coming in with, well, people, when they say they're a nihilist, they don't necessarily mean that they don't want to create an ethical system. They just mean
that's not what I was saying. I was saying because he is a descriptive nihilist, why does he have value on the original state of nature instead of trying to prescribe his own value eventually if he could magic wand it?
Right, so
I don't understand that.
So I can answer that question quite briefly and easily. So nihilism means I don't believe in things. I don't believe in philosophies or religions or what have you. But it doesn't mean that I can't acknowledge the difference between a rock crystal and a pebble. Now, I don't believe the rock crystal has magical value or, in a sense, any cultural value. But, there's a difference here. It's not about denying reality. Now, a rock crystal is different from a pebble. A jungle is different from a desert. So it's completely absurd. It's equally absurd to say to a nihilist, well, you're a nihilist, therefore you can smash up all these diamonds and crystals because you see them as having no value. Or to say to a nihilist, well, you're a nihilist, therefore it doesn't matter to you if we cut down the forest and allow it to be replaced with a desert. Desertification destroys the jungle and replaces it with a desert. Well, of course there's a difference. I just don't believe that there are gods or spirits or even abstract philosophies or principles like communism involved. But it is actually, this goes all the way back to Sextus Empiricus in ancient Greece and Rome. Sextus Empiricus is an underrated philosopher, by the way, guys, and classical skepticism. People used to say that to the skeptics too, like, oh, well, you're a skeptic, therefore you don't care if you get hit by a wagon. No, that's not what it means. It doesn't mean I'm insensate. I'm oblivious to the difference between a rock and a crystal or a forest and a desert. It doesn't fall.
Well, apparently you want it to stay a forest. You don't want it, or you don't want it to be changed in any regard, which I don't see why you would not want to make it better for the animals if you had the philosophical magic wand. Just ask yourself.
Perfect. Here's the answer to that question. Because I don't believe in your concept of better. I regard that as a religious concept. So you asked a great question. You said, why don't you want to make the forest better? I'm a nihilist. What you've just alluded to as better, which
but you seem to value the well-being of humans and animals, so I don't see why you wouldn't want there to be more of that. And you could still maintain the forest in theory. I mean, if you have the philosophical magic wand, you can still maintain something that resembles what you care about as a forest.
Look, I have nothing further to say on that. But I mean, I'd just say I have answered your question. I appreciate your difference of opinion. It's fine.
Anyone else on this kind of topic, or are you guys good? Because we can move on to some other stuff.
I was just going to hear what you want to say to me about DXE and wrap it up, because my girlfriend, I think my girlfriend's going to record a YouTube video, actually.
Oh, totally. Yeah, well, with DXE, I mean, I think there's been a lot of stuff in the air lately. I don't know if it's been in the air for longer than it's been on my radar. But, I mean, people are... I watched your video, actually, the other day on this, and I've talked to individuals and organizers for some of the other animal, I guess, organizations that I think are a bit more credible. And there seems to be some general complaints about a lack of transparency with respect to fundraising. I've also heard complaints about basically cult-like behavior. So I don't know how true all of this is, but apparently having people separate from their families if they continue eating meat, creating this compound housing where everyone is living. And then there's some other things like how effective their activism is. I mean, I personally, with activism, my whole thing is I understand there's huge character variation. I'm often on the shit end of the stick of, oh, this guy's such an asshole, like he's so bad for veganism, despite the fact that I've turned hundreds and hundreds of people vegan. But so I try to be pretty who's going off right now? Who's got all that noise? Can you mute whoever that is? Yeah, so I've got a lot of acceptance for different activism styles, but I also recognize that there is such a thing as ineffective activism. I mean, I'm sure that exists, and I personally, at this point, am persuaded that DXE doing like the cry about a sheep and scream their story at a restaurant full of people who hate you is in that category. So yeah, just any of that shit if you want to comment on it. And one final thing is, I'm going to host a debate once I can find someone who will take the pro DXE side, which you're right. I have had a lot of trouble finding someone who will do that. I want to maybe put out a call and see if I can get an organizer for DXE or someone to actually come and defend the organization live, and then I can get a critic like you or someone else to come do the other side, and I'll mod it. So yeah, just any of that if you have anything to say.
Yeah, my father did not say many wise things to me, perhaps none at all. But I remember he once said to me, we were in an art museum, and he said, sort of the common run of people, they always ask the wrong question or make the wrong statement when they say that's not art, like that's not a painting. They dislike something, they say that's not art. So the question is whether or not it's good art, whether or not it's great art. The fact that it's hanging in a gallery, means that it's art. You know what I mean? Like, this is just ridiculous. And likewise, a large part of what we're talking about as activism, this is an art form. It's not a science. Of course, I've been involved in political science, quote unquote political science. But exactly the kind of examples you're talking about, running on a baseball field, trying to interrupt a baseball game, interrupting a lecture from Bernie Sanders, screaming in a Chipotle, the various kinds of antics they engage in. And indeed, you can even question this about, the types of videos they make about rescuing animals, the cute animals on the farm. Clearly, we can talk about this as art. Sorry, I don't actually mean we would use the term art. But my point is, yes, you can talk about it being effective or ineffective. But ultimately, there are questions like: is this in good taste or is this in bad taste? Is this, is this good or bad activism? I think is in large part a kind of aesthetic question, more than it is one that we can quantify and come to those kinds of conclusions about. Sorry if that's a depressing answer.
No, it's a fine
bad.
answer.
I think it's bad in that sense,
Okay, sorry, I was just I'm just walking outside. Yeah, and so, do you think they are a cult?
Two things. One, no. And two, it kind of is a very easy way to criticize something, to reduce it to being a cult. I was tempted to make a video recently about a group called Landmark, who are often referred to as a cult, and I decided not to. But, it really lets you dismiss something very rapidly to say it's a cult, doesn't it?
Mm.
Whereas it's much more difficult to get into why is this bad or just why is this stupid, I think the discourse would be a lot easier if we could just say, yeah, it's a cult.
Okay, I agree that I would never accept it as a throwaway statement. I was assuming if you took the yes position on that, you'd make a case for it, but you don't take the yes position. So I basically think it's look, when people tell me it's a cult based on their own experiences, I'm sympathetic. I understand why they're saying that, but I think in terms of a strict definition of the word cult, no, it's not a cult. Okay, I don't know enough to comment. So yeah,
right. You can call something insane or crazy or manipulative. It dominates people's lives. You can say bad things about something, but people say being a fan of Batman is a cult or something. Being a Star Trek fan is a cult. In a very loose sense, sure, but no, I don't think in a meaningful sense it can be called a cult.
All right. Well, if DXE commits mass suicide, I am going to hold you to that statement.
Hey, you don't have to be in a cult to commit suicide. Hey,
that'll be the next debate.
That'll be the debate. Was it or was it not irrational?
Yeah, and then the other. What was the other thing?
I was just going to encourage you. I think it's it's a nice idea. You can put up a video trying to invite someone who's an organizer, and you can specify if you want them to be DXE Global or something, because they have this weird terminology for the hierarchy within the organization. I believe DXE Global is the elite group of who's in charge.
Yeah, if some lower level guy comes on and defends and gets spanked, then if higher level people start trying to say, oh, that's not really us, then the response to that is just going to be, okay, come do a better job.
Okay, no, but I think that's a very.
But yeah,
you know,
I hear you though.
I think it's a morally positive thing to do to try to invite someone to come out and discuss these things. I'd also say, you know, a lot of the criticism they endure is unreasonable. A lot of ex-members, a lot of it's about the sex lives of people within DXE, which, you know, is not. I've got 17 videos criticizing them, and that's not what they're about. You know, it's this very, very strange thing.
Yeah, well, I think that's come also from like intersectional types largely, and they of course are gonna always try to amplify shit like that.
Well, right, but I mean, like, some of it's real, but I mean, like, look, you know, people tried to do this to me. They tried to paint me as a bad guy because of the circumstances of my divorce with my ex-wife. And it's like, you know, of course, also what they said about this were lies. It was one of the situations like, look, even if what you're saying is true, who cares? Like, if I had a terrible divorce with my ex-wife, how does that impact my position on dog castration or how to organize a protest movement or the future of veganism? It just, you know, doesn't matter. So there is a lot of noise about that kind of stuff, which I'm not really concerned about. But I think, again, you or anyone here, you can look at the playlist of videos on my channel. There are a lot of substantive concerns about TXT, kind of in principle and in practice. And
I do have to say that I felt was a very good video. So I do actually encourage people to go and watch that. And I would just say, like, look, I try to be very upfront about any areas of knowledge where I don't know shit, and I don't really know shit about a lot of areas of veganism. So one of those is the kind of structure and function of our organizations. I don't really know much about it, but with DXE in particular, it's hit a point where I've heard so much complaining from so many different people, some of whom I consider pretty credible, and not all of whom I would even put a name on, that I personally am wondering if they are actually just a bad thing for veganism, and I kind of want to see someone defend the other side, because I've gotten a bit pushed onto that side at this point. So it's not something I know a whole lot about. That's why I'd like to just have a debate and let it be clear for everyone.
So I share on the playlist, the early videos are the ones that, like, I think the top 2 videos, they really show the footage of them doing their thing, of them actually getting arrested and dragged off by cops. I mean, it's interesting because I agree with you. You stated as a kind of opening caveat, you're really leery about dismissing people as bad for veganism. You're aware people have said that about you.
Very.
If you're bad for veganism, you know, and you should be. Yeah, so I'm really on the same page with that. I think it's a very lazy, ultimately self-righteous thing to just say, okay, this is bad for veganism. It should
lazy
stop.
Swayze.
Right.
Well, it's like her throwaway statement, just saying.
That's
but
right.
Yeah.
All the time, Unnatural Vegan relies on that. Right.
If it doesn't agree with her sentiments, it's bad for veganism. But sorry, go on.
And she also concluded my channel was bad for veganism. So we'll see, Swayze. Yeah. We'll see 10 years from now who's accomplished what in this movement. You know, that's really all I have to say. But no, and likewise, I agree with you. You have to have a kind of broad heuristic approach to seeing what works and what doesn't in terms of activism and public outreach and education. I think those are questions we have to ask.
And sorry to butt in one other thing. You have to have some level of patience for troubleshooting. People, we don't have it all worked out. People will do stupid shit. You have to look at what are their intentions, because intentions are all that matter ever in any situation. I'm kidding. But you do have to look at their intentions and go, okay, is this a kind of like a one-off fuck-up on their way to developing a good tactic, or is this characteristic of them?
Right. Trial and error. You know, but look, I don't know if you know the group 269 Life.
I don't.
But 269 Life, their distinctive thing is branding themselves with a cattle iron. You know, so they take a searing hot piece of metal, and while protesting, they sear the number 269 into their flesh, which, you know, is not only a spectacle, but then their members are marked for life with this. It's not a tattoo, you know, it's burned into their skin, you know. Now, as extreme as that is, I mean, if that's not extreme, what is? I'm not going to jump to the conclusion that they're doing more harm than good, or that they're bad for veganism. I mean,
no, I would not either.
But I don't want to do it, and I don't want my daughter to do it. If my daughter's only 5 years old. If my daughter grows up and she says, hey, I'm going to join 269 and get this branded into my skin, you know, I'm against it. So just say my tolerance is pretty wide. But in terms of my role as a critic in the movement, yes, for many years I've been saying univocally DXE is bad and it's only getting worse. And I've been right. So, yeah, the other question you say about troubleshooting or trial and error.
Which I throw in with troubleshooting. You cannot chalk this up to troubleshooting anymore with DXE.
That's right.
This is characteristic of them.
But it's also true. So I got to go. It's been great talking to you guys, but I'm going to go after this. But, you know, it's also really sad that they used to be committed to this ethic of transparency and receiving all criticism. They said they were founded on social science principles. Again, I've talked about this in videos, and that like the social sciences, they were going to take on criticism and adapt and all this stuff. And today, none of that is true. I mean, it's true. By contrast, they really have more cult-like behavior. Anything that's wrong gets covered up and denied, and you're denounced as an enemy of the movement if you dare to mention something wrong, and so on. You know, so I just say their original founding principles were supposed to embrace this kind of self-criticism and adaptation. It was supposedly socials. Their USP, their unique selling point, was that they were going to take social science principles and apply them to vegan activism as never before. And thus, by their own criteria, by their own standards, they have failed. They've moved the goalposts. But I think that's really worth noticing. And the other goalpost they set up themselves was to be a fully horizontal, fully transparent, leaderless movement. And of course, you know, it's the opposite extreme. They are instead, again, I see why people call it a cult. They're this special hierarchical community in, you know, this one town in California, in Berkeley, and it has all these hero worshiping, leader worshiping features and so on. You know, blah 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 blah. So yeah, I mean, it's whether or not they were bad in principle when they started, kind of on day one, they're a really instructive example we can all learn about how things go horribly wrong. Soon after that. Yeah. Yeah.
It's so funny to just talk about someone just full confidence, like they're just an example in failure. I mean, this is one of the things that I find funny about us. Like, they'll just tell you deadpan. I believe that unnatural vegan is literally mentally retarded, or just. I have to say that was one of the hardest I've laughed in a long time. I laughed really hard at that. But
I think it was hard to make you laugh, Isaac. You're always laughing when I'm around, but maybe when I'm not around, you don't laugh so much.
No, I do laugh quite a lot, but some things make me laugh particularly hard, and just genuine deadpan belief delivering that was pretty funny. Anyway, man, if you got to go, then go.
Great.
But it sounds like with the DXE stuff, it seems like you know a lot about the history of the movement and the structure of the organization and some of the people in it. So, I mean, you'd be the right kind of person to take the con side. So if I do find someone, I mean, you don't have to commit because you don't know who it will be, but I'll show you who that person is, and possibly you would debate.
No, sure. I'm willing to commit in broad brush strokes. It's just the usual caveats. Well, unless I'm busy or, you know, physically can't. No, sure. I mean, you know, unless there's some reason why I can't at the particular time. Sure, I'd be happy to contribute. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. That's good. I got someone for the con side. Well, nice
Great
talking. Alrighty. Keep well.